I froze when I saw my wife offering her glass to another man at the company couple's dinner, and in that intimate gesture, I saw everything that was no longer mine. I stood up unhurriedly, letting the silence say what words couldn't. There was no argument, only the end. And it's strange how certain pains don't scream, don't bleed, don't break glasses or lock doors. They just settle in. Like a dense emptiness, weighing on the chest without moving. That night, the world didn't fall apart, it just shifted. I saw love slip through my fingers, without a sound, without a goodbye. And yet, it was as if everything inside me had collapsed. There was something in that exchange of glasses, in that shared smile, that spoke of an ancient intimacy, something cultivated far from my eyes, something that could never be undone. She didn't look at me when I left. She didn't need to. She knew. And so did I. I knew none of it started that night, that it had all been dead for some time, and I, like so many others, was only the last to realize it. It's funny how betrayal doesn't arrive suddenly, it grows in small omissions, in the cell phone turned upside down, in the ring that doesn't return, in the automatic kiss, in the smell of perfume that doesn't belong in the house. Betrayal is an accumulated absence, silent, persistent. It doesn't hurt all at once, it spreads like rust. And before we know it, what was once a bond has become a knot. In the days that followed, she tried to keep the hidden romance afloat, like someone who still believes a broken toy can be put back together. She sent messages trying to justify it, offering excuses that sounded more like insults. She said she was confused, that things weren't what they seemed, that it was all just a difficult time. But nothing she said would change the fact, she didn't choose me. And that's the true weight of betrayal, it's not the other person's touch, nor the hidden kisses, but the choice she made. She chose someone who wasn't me. And that speaks volumes, speaks louder than any pretty words she might still try to use. The lover disappeared as soon as the fantasy lost its luster. Maybe he didn't want to deal with reality, with the mess left behind. Maybe he just wanted the game, the forbidden, the risk. And she, now alone, surrounded by regret, began to sink into the silence I already knew well. The difference is that, while I slowly rebuilt my life, she drowned in the memories of what she destroyed with her own hands. I didn't move on in a hurry. Relearning to trust was a daily exercise. Relearning to breathe without the weight of distrust, to sleep without the anguish of what's happening on the other side of the bed. It takes time. It's a lonely, hard process, but possible. And when the pain settled into some corner of my memory, I found a new love. It wasn't overwhelming, it wasn't a movie crush. It was light. It was sincere. It was someone who offered loyalty in their eyes, peace in their gestures, constancy in their days. Someone who didn't need to promise anything, because they delivered without saying a word. And it was at that moment, when I no longer felt anger, pain, or longing, that she returned. She knocked on my door like someone carrying the weight of 1,000 sleepless nights. She didn't come with promises or cheap excuses. She came with downcast eyes and the choked voice of someone who'd already understood she'd lost. She said she remembered every detail, that the smell of our coffee still lingered in her house, that she couldn't listen to our songs without crying, that she felt my absence like a ghost haunting every corner. She said she regretted it, and that she didn't expect to be loved again, but that she needed to tell me she still loved me. I listened to it all unhurriedly, just as I'd left that night. I took a deep breath, looked into her eyes, and told her I forgave her. Because forgiving, then and there, was no longer a concession to her, it was a liberation for me. I no longer carried that story as a wound. It was just a scar. Not to rekindle, but to bring closure. So she could move on in peace, and so could I. She cried. Not from anger, nor from manipulation. She cried like someone who finally understands what she's lost. Not the man I was, but the love I offered. And when she saw me leave again, she didn't try to hold me back. She just stood there, watching the end. An end that had happened long before, but that only in that moment was fully understood. The truth is that those who cheat almost never think about what happens next. Only about the now. The heat of the moment, the adrenaline of conquest. But the aftermath always arrives. And with it, regret. True love, when it leaves, doesn't slam its door. It simply stops living there. And nothing is more painful than realizing that the person you betrayed has finally become happy, without you. She tried to love again, but something inside her had broken. Guilt turns the soul into something heavy, difficult to carry. She said she couldn't trust anyone anymore, but deep down, what she couldn't do was trust herself. The fear of repeating her mistakes, of being betrayed like she had, of hurting someone again, paralyzed her. And I, even from afar, wished she would find peace. Because truly loving someone is also wishing for their healing, even when the love is gone. I moved on. I got married. I had children. I started smiling naturally again. She, at some point, found her way of life. I never heard from her again. And maybe that's for the best. Because some stories don't need an epilogue. They just need to be closed with dignity. But there was one last thing she said to me, before she walked out of my life for the second time. Something I've never forgotten, something that stays with me to this day as a gentle reminder that the choices we make define not only what we lose, but also what we will never be again. She said, "If I had valued you when there was still time, maybe I would be happy today too." And that phrase remained. As an echo. As a lesson. As a memory. But there's something she never knew. Something I never had the courage to say. Something that might change everything. And that's where this story really begins. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not romanticize and never support any type of betrayal. All the stories told are fiction, but inspired by real emotions and situations, with the clear objective, to show how betrayal destroys lives, corrodes bonds and leaves marks that not even time can erase. Brace yourself. What you're about to hear is more than a story, it's a warning. Press play. And hold on tight. Because this story will shake you. They met like someone who accidentally stumbles upon something fate has already left in their path. There was no immediate explosion of feelings, no hasty promises of eternal love, but there was something in the way they looked at each other, the way they listened to each other, the way the silences between conversations didn't cause discomfort. Daniel was one of those men who didn't need much to fill a room, his presence wasn't loud, but solid. He was a rare man who didn't impose himself, but was naturally noticed. He worked as a project manager at a mid-sized construction company and carried in his eyes a calmness that only those who have experienced too much disappointment learn to cultivate. Sophia, on the other hand, was light-hearted, opinionated, and had a restless glint in her eyes. She worked as a financial analyst and stood out for her discipline. When they first crossed paths in a cafe near downtown, he reading an old book with a worn cover, she distracted with headphones and a coffee in her hands. The exchange of glances was brief, but left a mark. They started talking by chance, like someone expecting nothing and finding everything. Daniel admired Sophia's practical approach to life, her ability to juggle 1,000 things at once without losing her sweetness. She, in turn, found in him the safe haven she so often claimed not to need, but which, deep down, she had always sought. It wasn't a relationship full of comings and goings, nor one that burns with jealousy or shouting. It was calm, almost silent. A love that was built like a well-built house, brick by brick, without haste. And perhaps for that reason, it seemed to stand the test of time. Friends commented on how the two complemented each other. Daniel had a subtle sense of humor, the kind that makes you laugh effortlessly, and Sophia laughed in a way that felt like a reward. Their routine was made up of small gestures, breakfast in bed on Sundays, mid-afternoon texts, walks after dinner. There were never grand declarations on social media or expensive gifts. But there was always presence. There was constancy. And that, for both of them, was love. They married after 3 years of dating, in an intimate, simple, and emotionally charged ceremony. Their parents, their closest friends, the music they chose together, the handwritten vows. There was truth in that moment, and a shared certainty that the future was being built with strong roots. They set up a small but meaningful apartment. Every painting, every piece of furniture, every plant hanging on the balcony held a story. Sophia liked to cook on weekends, and Daniel always volunteered to wash the dishes, not out of obligation, but out of pleasure. They established rituals: pizza on Fridays, TV marathons on Saturdays, reading together before bed. It wasn't a fairy tale. There were gray days, small arguments about bills, fatigue, what to eat. But there was respect, and above all, a desire to continue choosing each other even when emotions weren't raw. Over time, the routine began to impose itself more rigidly. The demands of work increased. Daniel started leaving earlier and returning later. Sophia, always so organized, began taking on more and more tasks on her own. They still loved each other, but intimacy began to give way to habit. The good morning kiss was replaced by a quick touch on the shoulder, Saturday lunch was now taken care of with delivery, and the bed, once a space for conversation, became a place of silence. But still, there were bonds. On birthdays, on important dates, in the little "how are you" messages, the care remained. But, deep down, something was starting to feel out of place, and neither of them quite knew how to fix it. The holiday season brought memories and also demands. The visits to family, the comments about children, who hadn't arrived yet, the looks from relatives that seemed to demand constant happiness. Sophia felt a restlessness she couldn't name. Sometimes she'd find herself staring out the window for long minutes, listening to old songs, remembering dreams from when she was younger. Daniel, for his part, felt a fatigue that wasn't just physical. He began to wonder if he was truly living the life he wanted, if something had been lost along the way. But they didn't talk about it. Maybe out of fear of facing it. Maybe out of fear of discovering they were right. Even so, there was affection. When Sophia was sick, Daniel cared for her patiently. When he was stressed at work, she would prepare his favorite meal and listen to him vent. There were looks that said, "I'm here," even if silent. There was a history that united them, and that still outweighed any passing discomfort. Or so they both believed. A new cycle began when Sophia's company underwent internal changes. Restructuring, new projects, new faces. She began attending more events, after-hours meetings, short trips. Daniel, always understanding, supported her. He trusted her. He was never the controlling type. He didn't need to know every step, every conversation. He believed that love was also about allowing the other person to grow, to soar. And she, in part, admired this. But there were days when she wished he'd ask more questions, pay more attention to details. And when he didn't ask, she didn't tell him either. Not out of malice, but because she felt he might not notice. Then came the invitations to dinners as a couple, company social events, and formal appearances. Daniel began accompanying her on these occasions, but he felt he no longer fit in. Her colleagues had a different kind of conversation, a different energy. He remained discreet, polite, but didn't hide his discomfort. Sophia noticed, but preferred to pretend otherwise. Little by little, she became more involved in the new rhythm of life, new friendships, new circles. Daniel remained the same, kind, calm, present, but something inside her seemed to be searching for something different, something she couldn't yet name. Despite this, in the eyes of others, they were still a model couple. They shared smiling photos on birthdays, welcomed friends into their home with warmth, and helped each other with family commitments. The world saw a strong, stable, supportive couple. And in many ways, they still were. They still shared a bed, bills, and plans. They still knew where each other kept their things, each other's coffee preferences, and preferred bedtimes. But there was a silent distance growing between them. A kind of invisible wall made of unspoken routines, repressed desires, and disconnections that pretended to be fleeting. Daniel missed things he couldn't explain. Long late-night conversations, plans made with a twinkle in his eye, spontaneous touches. Sometimes he looked at Sophia and wondered if she still saw in him the same man she'd chosen years ago. Sophia, in turn, carried a kind of silent anguish. He wanted more, but didn't know exactly what. He wanted to find himself again, but didn't know where he'd lost himself. And in these gaps, the silence expanded. It was at one of these dinners for two that everything began to change dramatically. A sophisticated atmosphere, restrained laughter, and frequent toasts. Daniel stood beside Sophia, watching, listening, but with a growing unease in his chest. She, on the other hand, seemed different. Lighter, more relaxed, more engaged in conversations that didn't include him. He noticed, but said nothing. And this nothing repeated itself for weeks, like a string slowly being stretched. The nights began to change. Daniel spent more time alone, listening to music, reading, trying to understand what was wrong. Sophia said she was tired, preferred to go to bed earlier, and avoided deep conversations. And yet, nothing was said clearly. They were both heading in different directions, but they still shared the same home, the same commitments, the same vows made years ago. Like someone who insists on keeping a painting on the wall, even though the frame is already cracking. They were there. Still together. Still present. But something was definitely about to change. And they didn't know it yet, but what came next would change everything they believed about love, loyalty, and loss. Because some stories don't end with screams or slammed doors. Some end with silence. And others, with looks that no longer recognize each other. But no story ends, before revealing its secret. It was curious how the small signs accumulated like dust on the furniture, invisible at first, but bothersome over time. Sophia, who used to come home complaining about the traffic or laughing at the day's small tragedies, now avoided talking about her time away. Her accounts became generic, mechanical, as if following a rehearsed script. Daniel noticed, even without meaning to, that the details were disappearing, people's names, spontaneous dialogue, unpretentious comments. Everything seemed filtered, as if she feared being too transparent. He wasn't paranoid, and his love for her had always been calm enough not to imagine tragedies where there was only silence, but the lack of connection was no longer a pause, it was a new normal. At dinner, Sophia seemed physically present but absent in her gaze. She checked her phone with a frequency she hadn't seen before, laughing softly as she read unsaid messages. Daniel watched silently. Not out of suspicion, but instinct. The eyes of those who love can sense when something is broken, even without a sound. And his had already noticed. When he tried to talk about the week, she changed the subject. When he suggested a trip, she pleaded tiredness. When he tried to get closer, she gently backed away. There was no confrontation. There was no fight. There was only a gradual, delicate distancing, as if the space between them were being filled by something invisible. One night, when he arrived home early from work, Daniel found Sophia sleeping on the couch with her phone slipped from her hand. He hesitated before picking it up, not out of lack of trust, but out of respect for what had always been sacred between them. But the phone vibrated and the screen lit up. A notification. A message. A name he didn't recognize. The brief content simply said, "I dreamed about you again. Your scent is still here." He stood still for a few seconds, as if time had suspended the air around him. He carefully placed the phone back on the couch and went upstairs without waking her. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He simply lay on his side and stared at the wall for hours, in silence. In the days that followed, Daniel didn't mention what he saw. He chose the path of silence to observe. He began to notice patterns, repetitions, brief disappearances. He began to question internally how long this had been happening. How long had she shared what was theirs with someone else? But what hurt most wasn't the betrayal itself, it was the fact that she still slept beside him, still smiled at random moments, still maintained the appearance of normality. The disloyalty, there, was more than a hidden kiss. It was the daily theater of a love that only one of them believed still existed. Sophia seemed restless. Sometimes she spoke enthusiastically about changes at work. She talked about new people, new ideas, events she needed to attend. Daniel listened without interrupting, pretending not to know anything more than she was saying. At times, he considered confronting her. Putting everything on the table. But there was something deeper holding back her words, a need to understand how far she would go, how far she would be able to push this act. The truth, for him, was already clear. All that remained now was to watch the outcome. The tension between them became a silent presence in the house. They didn't argue, but their affection seemed staged. Gestures that once came naturally now felt choreographed. Her good mornings were automatic. Her hand touch during dinner was rehearsed. Daniel began to withdraw more. He sought refuge in long walks, in books, in anything that would distance him from the feeling of being deceived in his own home. Sophia, on the other hand, seemed to feel freer with the distance. She laughed more on the phone, changed clothes more often before going out, wore different perfumes. And yet, she said everything was fine. One Saturday night, she invited him to a couple's dinner hosted by the company. It was the first time in months she'd suggested something for two. Daniel hesitated, but accepted. Not out of hope, but out of necessity. I felt something was about to happen, and I needed to be there. The restaurant was sophisticated, with low lighting, ambient music, and quiet laughter at every table. Sophia wore a black dress he'd never seen before. Her hair was tied up in a unique way. Her eyes were vibrant, almost euphoric. She greeted everyone with intimacy, as if this were the world she truly wanted to live in. Daniel, sitting beside her, observed everything. Her smiles, her touches on his arm during conversations, the way she leaned in to listen to a particular man at the opposite table. The glances they exchanged weren't accidental. There was a frequency between them that only those who have loved know. He no longer needed proof. He didn't need to be caught on camera. Everything was there, wide open, even under the appearance of coincidence. Dinner continued formally, but Daniel's eyes fixed on one moment. A small, yet meaningful detail. Sophia, smiling, offered her glass of wine to the man at the other table. A simple yet intimate gesture. A kind of intimacy that only builds over time, through sharing. He accepted, touching her fingers naturally. They laughed. And Daniel, in that moment, didn't feel anger. He felt absence. An emptiness that filled every space within him. He got up from the table without making a fuss. He didn't look back. He paid the bill silently and left. It took Sophia a few minutes to realize. When she noticed his absence, she searched for him, but it was already late. Daniel didn't return that night. He slept at his brother's house, in silence. The next morning, he found some messages from her on his phone. "You disappeared, are you okay? We need to talk." But he didn't reply. He spent the next few days lost in himself, trying to sort out his inner turmoil. He didn't cry, he didn't scream. But he felt every piece of himself slowly crumbling. He felt the weight of the end, even though he hadn't yet pronounced it. She tried to explain herself. He masked his guilt with vague excuses. He said he was just a colleague, that everything was being misinterpreted. But eyes don't lie. And hers carried guilt. A kind of guilt that only appears when someone already knows they've made a mistake and been caught. Daniel listened, silently, with the serenity of someone who no longer expects explanations. It's no longer about knowing why. It's about accepting that what was once love is now just a memory. As the weeks passed, Sophia began to feel uncomfortable with Daniel's calm. She expected fights, confrontations, reactions. But he simply walked away, slowly, with dignity. What destroyed her wasn't the impending breakup, but the fact that he was leaving lightly. Without carrying the weight of hatred, without dramatizing. She tried to revive some emotion between them, sparked more intense conversations, suggested trips, but it all felt out of place. The break had already happened. The bond that united them was broken, and she knew it. It was on a cloudy afternoon that he finally spoke. They sat on the sofa, face to face. Daniel took a deep breath and said he knew. That he'd known for a long time. That he didn't need proof, names, details. And that, for all they'd been through, he'd rather end it without shouting. Sophia cried. She tried to grasp words, memories, moments. But everything slipped away like sand through her fingers. He stood, kissed her forehead, and left. She stood there, alone. For the first time, without excuses to tell herself. For the first time, confronting her own reflection. Her lover, little by little, began to fade. His enthusiasm faded as the adrenaline of the forbidden faded. And she, without her husband and without the other, began to face the echo of her choices. But there was something more. Something Daniel didn't yet know. Something she kept closely guarded. A secret that wasn't just about the betrayal, but about something much deeper. A detail that, when revealed, would change the way he viewed everything they'd experienced. And the truth was already on its way. He didn't see her for weeks. Since that afternoon when he got up from the couch and left with the same serenity with which he had once chosen her to be the woman of his life, Daniel no longer looked for Sophia. He avoided places where their paths might cross, silenced the channels where there had once been any exchange. Not because he hated her, but because he no longer saw the point in keeping alive a story whose end had already been written by her very absence. He had learned, through pain, that love doesn't scream to be heard, it withdraws silently when it no longer finds space to exist. Meanwhile, she sank into an empty daily routine, where not even her lover seemed to make sense. The man who promised to be a shelter now became a faint breeze. The messages dwindled, the calls stopped, and the confident smile she wore during meetings slowly faded. The fantasy lost its charm. And reality, harsh and relentless, took its place. That cold morning, Sophia woke up with a new weight on her shoulders. It was an anguish she could no longer hide, even from herself. The tired face in the mirror reminded her every day that losing Daniel hadn't been an accident. It had been a choice. A decision fueled by small betrayals of presence, by implicit promises made to a man she barely knew, while destroying, piece by piece, everything she had built alongside someone who had loved her silently, consistently, and patiently. It was then that she decided to seek him out, but not to beg for his return. She needed to talk. She needed to tell him the whole truth, even if he didn't want to hear it. She needed to rid herself of the guilt that was eating away at her insides. She met Daniel at a small cafe, where they had been once before early in their relationship. She didn't make an appointment, just showed up, as if surrendering the last of her pride in exchange for a bit of dignity. He was sitting by the window, reading. The same gesture as always, the same calm air. When he saw her, his face showed no surprise, just a slight tilt of his head, as if to say, "I know why you came." She sat across from him without asking permission, her eyes teary and her voice low. She asked him to listen to her, even if it was for the last time. Daniel closed his book, set his cup down on its saucer, and replied that he was there. Ready to listen. Sophia began with difficulty, stumbling over her words. She said she wasn't there to apologize, that she already knew forgiveness was no longer necessary, because love, that was gone. But there was something she'd never had the courage to tell him, and now, faced with the emptiness that remained, it needed to be said. She took a deep breath, clasped her hands on the table, and looked at him with eyes filled with something that mixed regret with real pain. She said that, months before the separation, when they were still trying to save their marriage, when they still ate dinner together even in silence, when he still asked how she was even though he already knew the answer, she began writing in a diary. A notebook hidden in the back of her closet, where she poured out all the feelings she couldn't say out loud. Not about her lover. But about Daniel. He looked at her, confused, and she continued. She told him that even when she was being disloyal, even when she believed she was searching for something new, she wrote down everything she felt for him. That it wasn't hate, nor indifference. It was pain. A pain she couldn't name, an inner dissatisfaction that nothing in the world seemed to fill. That the betrayal didn't begin with desire, but with emptiness. And that, deep down, she hoped he would find out. That he would end the silence, that he would scream, that he would react, that he would save her from herself. But he didn't. And that sank her even further. Daniel remained silent for a few seconds. His coffee was already growing cold, but he didn't touch it again. He was still, attentive, digesting everything with the calm of someone who has prepared himself for every version of the truth, except this one. Sophia then pulled a folded sheet of paper from her pocket and placed it on the table. It was a copy of the last page of the diary. And there, written in her own handwriting, was the revelation. Not about the lover, not about the end. But about the real secret. She had become pregnant with Daniel in the second year of their marriage. She found out by chance, during a routine checkup. She hid it. Not out of hatred. But out of fear. Fear that it would trap her in a life she was trying to escape. Fear that her son would become an anchor in a sea of doubt. And in that silence, in that internal conflict she herself created, she had an abortion. Alone. Without telling anyone. Without giving him the chance to choose, to feel, to be a father. She carried this decision in secret, stifling the scream that grew within her every day. And it was from that moment on that everything fell apart, even though they were still together. Guilt ate at her, forcing her to distance herself, forcing her to seek outside what had never ceased to exist within her home. Daniel lowered his eyes. For a moment, it seemed like the world had gone silent. The city outside was alive, cars passing, birds chirping, the barista in the background chatting with another customer, but inside him, everything stopped. He said nothing. Not right away. He just stared at the paper, the written words, her handwriting. Then he looked up and asked why. Sophia responded with tears, saying she didn't know how to explain. That she was immature, selfish, lost. That she wanted to run away, and that she thought a child would trap her. That she didn't feel ready, and that she was afraid he would hate her if he knew. But, over time, he realized the real mistake wasn't the act itself. It was the silence. It was not allowing him to participate in something that was also his. Daniel took a deep breath, closed his eyes for a few seconds, and let it out slowly. His face was calm, but his eyes were brimming with tears. When he spoke, his voice was firm, without anger, but filled with pain. He said he didn't hate her. That perhaps what hurt most wasn't what she did, but the fact that it hadn't been considered. That she'd made a decision alone about something that belonged to both of them. That what hurt most was imagining what it would have been like. What it would have been like to hold a child in his arms. What it would have been like to see him smile, to grow. He said he'd already lost her love, and now he realized he'd also lost a part of himself he'd never get back. Sophia wept silently. She didn't ask for anything. She just listened. He then stood up, put the paper back on the table, looked at her one last time, and said he forgave her. Not for her, but for him. Because carrying resentment would be a burden she didn't deserve to carry for a lifetime. But now, more than ever, she knew that what had existed between them was truly over. She nodded, lacking the strength to say anything. When he left, the cold seemed denser. The street seemed longer. But there was a lightness in his steps. For the first time since the end, he felt like he had closed a cycle. Sophia sat for a long time, staring at the page in front of her. The words she had written with such pain were now exposed. And even with the pain, there was relief. Because sometimes, the only way to free yourself is to face the worst in yourself. But fate, even when it seems to have closed all doors, still has surprises in store. And there was something neither of them could have foreseen. One last twist of life. One final outcome. And what would come next, would change everything again. Daniel didn't return home that day. After leaving Sophia at that cafe, he walked through unfamiliar streets for hours, with no clear direction, driven only by the irrational desire to distance himself from everything that reminded him of the life he'd lost. Her revelation was etched in his mind like a deafening echo, hammering insistently at every corner of his memory. It wasn't just the fact that he'd been betrayed, that he'd been deceived, but the realization that he'd lived for years alongside a woman who'd made decisions for him, kept silent about him, aborted a part of him without even granting him the dignity of knowing. It was an absence that was now taking shape, carrying the weight of everything that never happened. And what hurt most wasn't the loss of the unborn child, but the certainty that he could never trust in the same way again. Trust, once broken, isn't rebuilt with apologies, much less with belated regret. It shatters like glass, no matter how carefully the shards are glued together, the cuts remain. That night, he slept in a cheap hotel, without even taking off his shoes. The television was on mute, the lamp was on, the room impersonal, the smell of cleaning products mingling with fatigue. For the first time in a long time, Daniel cried. Not theatrically, nor desperately. She wept silently, her face in her hands, feeling the bitter taste of truth. She wept for the son she never had, for the life she envisioned that was ripped away without warning, for the trust she placed in someone who didn't know how to care for him. He wept for himself, for the man he tried to be, for having loved too much, for having believed too much. And after crying, she fell asleep like someone surrendering their body to exhaustion, not to consolation. The days that followed were silent. He blocked messages, withdrew from social media, and refused calls. I needed to breathe, away from everything. Away from her. Sophia respected it. Not because she accepted it, but because she understood there was nothing more she could do. She had crossed a line of no return. She tried to occupy her mind with work, with household chores, with anything that would keep her from looking inward. But inevitably, the memories came flooding back. The days she held the pregnancy test, the hours she spent sitting on the toilet, the silent phone call to the clinic, the hastily scheduled appointment, the anesthesia that didn't dull the pain. She remembered Daniel's face back then, the way he held her at night, unaware of what she was hiding. She remembered his silence, his blind trust, the calmness with which he believed they were simply going through a difficult time. And she felt ashamed. Not only for having betrayed him, but for having deprived him of the chance to love something that was his. The guilt was no longer a weight she carried, it was a part of her. A few weeks later, Daniel returned to the apartment. Not to get back together, but to pick up the last of his things. Sophia was there, sitting on the balcony, hugging an old coat of his that she kept in the back of the closet. When she saw him enter, she didn't try to get up. He didn't say anything right away, either. He walked to the bedroom, picked up the box he'd already set aside, and before leaving, he stopped in front of her. There was something different in his eyes. It wasn't anger, nor sadness. It was maturity. The pain hadn't disappeared, but he seemed to have organized it so that it didn't hurt as much when touched. She, in turn, seemed smaller than before. Not physically, but internally. The brightness she once had was now a shadow. And yet, there was no aggression between them. Only the strange peace of someone who no longer expects anything. She was the one who spoke first. She said she didn't expect to be forgiven. That she knew the loss was irreparable. But she wanted to be grateful for everything they'd shared before everything fell apart. That despite everything, he had been the only true love she'd ever known. And that she would spend the rest of her life living with the regret of not having been good enough to deserve him. Daniel listened in silence. Then she replied that forgiveness had already been given, not by her, but by himself. That bitterness no longer had a place in his life. That the love he once felt didn't deserve to be remembered with resentment. She said their story deserved respect, even with its mistakes. And that, because of that, she was leaving behind not only the relationship, but the burden. She cried. She didn't try to stop him. She just said thank you. He said goodbye with a slight wave. There was no hug. No kiss. No promise. Just a silent ending. As he left, Sophia knew it was final. There was no going back. There was no room for rebuilding. And, in a way, she felt at peace. Because sometimes, accepting the end is the only possible way to begin again. Months passed. Daniel reorganized his life. He moved, changed jobs, and resumed forgotten hobbies. He slowly, patiently, rebuilt himself. And amid this silent process of reconstruction, he met someone. Not by chance, nor out of desperation. He met a serene woman, who also bore scars but who didn't hide them. Someone who spoke little, but truthfully. The two grew closer slowly, as if understanding that loving again requires delicacy. There were no comparisons, no rush. Just the lightness of what is built with care. She listened attentively, looked into his eyes, touched him gently. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Not as an escape from the past, but as a choice for the present. Sophia, for her part, continued. She kept working, maintained her routine, but was never the same. She tried to connect with others, but couldn't trust or be trusted. The pain she caused others turned against her in the form of insecurity. She always thought she would be betrayed, always thought it wouldn't be enough. She started therapy, wrote letters she never sent, visited the clinic where the abortion was performed, and asked her conscience for forgiveness. It wasn't easy. But she was trying. She knew she wouldn't be loved as she was by Daniel. And this knowledge would stay with her forever. But she had learned something, that cheating isn't just breaking up with the other person, it's, above all, betraying yourself. And, over time, she began to seek the peace she never had. A few years later, by chance, they met again. It was in a bookstore. She was leafing through a blue-covered book, he was waiting in line to pay. Their eyes met. There was surprise, but no tension. Just a kind of silent recognition of someone who had shared an important story. Daniel smiled lightly, and she smiled back. He had a discreet ring on his finger, and she noticed. There was no jealousy. There was, yes, a strange kind of gratitude that he had moved on. Sophia was holding a book about motherhood. He noticed, but didn't ask. He simply said, "I hope you're well." And she replied, "I'm trying." He nodded and said goodbye with a, "Take care." She said, "You too." And each went their own way. She, with the awareness that some mistakes cannot be erased, but can be transformed into learning experiences. He, with the certainty that forgiveness, even when it doesn't reverse the past, is what allows for a brighter future. And sometimes, all true love needs, is to be experienced at the right time, with the right person. Because some pains come to teach. But some loves come, to heal. During the months that followed that brief and unexpected reunion at the bookstore, life resumed its course with an almost disconcerting calm. For Daniel, there was a new clarity in the days, a tranquility built on ruins that he could now visit without feeling hurt. It was no longer about forgetting what happened, nor about erasing the past, but about accepting that some stories, even when they don't have happy endings, play an essential role in the journey. He carried the scars, yes, but now they were marks of survival, not open wounds. The love that emerged after Sophia came not as a replacement, but as a cure. It was a more mature, more conscious, quieter, but also more steadfast love. With her, the new woman in his life, he had learned to love without fear, without walls, without haste, and this was a liberation he hadn't even known he needed until he experienced it. Sophia, however, despite having told the truth and faced her own mistakes with courage, still walked amidst the rubble of herself. She was no longer the determined and confident woman Daniel had once admired. He now carried the shadow of what he had destroyed and the responsibility of rebuilding something with the pieces that remained. He was afraid to love again, and even more so to be loved. She felt that true love, the kind given with surrender and fidelity, was something she had already had, wasted, and now belonged to another time, a time when she herself was a different person. She tried to occupy herself, to keep her routine in order, but there was a constant silence around her, a kind of absence that could not be filled with anything. Not with new books, not with new faces. It was a void born of the awareness that she had made irreversible decisions, and that no amount of personal growth would erase the impact of the choice she had made alone, silencing truths, sacrificing lives, betraying feelings. One late afternoon, sitting on a park bench with the wind blowing through her now shorter hair, she watched families pass by, children running, couples smiling complicitly. She didn't feel envy, but a kind of longing for something that, despite never having fully experienced, she had briefly touched with her fingers. That simple happiness, of building something with someone you trust, of belonging, of being home. She began to wonder, often, if it would be possible to experience it again, or if, somehow, her chance had passed. Not as punishment from the world, but as a direct consequence of her choices. This was the dilemma that pained her, knowing that the peace she wanted might only be attainable after accepting, with brutal honesty, that some losses are definitive. And that loving also involves not destroying. Daniel, on the other hand, was approaching a delicate and unexpected moment of transition. The woman he was with whom he had built something beautiful, was invited to work in another country. The offer was irresistible, and even knowing what distance meant, he didn't try to stop her. Not because he didn't love her, but because he had learned that true love isn't held by chains, and that preventing someone from soaring would be repeating the mistakes he so condemned. But this also presented him with a complex dilemma. Would he be willing to start over again? To face loneliness again, even after having found balance and peace? Or should he risk it, follow it, and change his entire life for this new love that, although sincere, wasn't yet the complete story of his soul? They talked about it at length. Sitting on the porch of the house they'd shared for a few months, with her bags already packed in the hallway, she took his hand and asked if he wanted to come with her. She told him she loved him, that she could see herself growing old with him, but that she also understood if he needed to stay. Daniel, looking at her, felt his heart sink. He wanted to go, but he also knew he needed to stay. Not out of fear, but because he felt there was something unfinished in his story, something he hadn't yet fully grasped. A feeling that wasn't about Sophia herself, but about himself. About the man he was, what he'd become, and what he still needed to understand. He told her he wouldn't go, but that he'd wait for her if she wanted to come back. And she, with eyes full of admiration, hugged him tightly and promised that, fate willing, they would meet again in due time. Sophia, in another part of the city, decided, for the first time, to do something she'd long avoided, write. She grabbed a new notebook, sat at the table, and began writing to Daniel. Not with the intention of sending it, but to free herself. She wanted to tell him everything she hadn't yet said, not about the mistakes, but about the small, good memories she held. She wrote about the way he looked at her while she slept, about the way he arranged the cutlery at meals, about how he held the steering wheel with one hand, absent-mindedly, singing old songs. She wrote about the rainy Sundays they'd spent in bed, about the difficult days he'd welcomed her without judgment, about the times she wanted to apologize but didn't have the courage. And when she finished, she closed the notebook with the feeling that, for the first time, she was accepting the end as something real. Not as something that could be reversed, but as a closed chapter that, despite everything, was important. Their lives, despite following different paths, were marked by profound reflection. Daniel began to see the past differently. He no longer felt anger or sadness, but rather a kind of compassion. He understood that Sophia, despite everything, was a woman in conflict with herself, and that her mistakes reflected fears many carry in silence. Forgiving her hadn't been a concession, it had been an act of self-love. And it transformed him. He, who previously believed fidelity was merely a matter of choice, came to understand that, often, infidelity stems from disloyalty to oneself. Sophia didn't just cheat on him with another man, she betrayed him when she chose to live a life she couldn't sustain, when she silenced her desires, when she lied to herself. And this understanding freed him even more. She, in turn, faced with the loneliness of her choices, began searching for ways to rebuild what was inside her before trying to share anything with anyone again. She became involved in social projects, dedicating time to people who needed help. She discovered in listening to others a way to redeem herself. She realized in the eyes of those carrying true pain that she was not alone. That guilt, when acknowledged and worked through, can be a starting point. Not of erasure, but of transformation. And, silently, she wished that one day she could look in the mirror with pride, not just regret. Daniel, sitting on the porch on another gray afternoon, gazed at the sky with his eyes closed, listening to the wind, feeling the light breathing. He had learned to be alone without feeling lonely. And this was a victory he didn't celebrate out loud, but one that transformed his every gesture. With each new day, he realized that the scars of the past no longer hurt. That he no longer needed to run from memories, nor repress them. That pain had transformed into wisdom. And that true love wasn't the kind that never fails, but the kind that endures even when everything else fails. There was a sense in the air that the definitive end was approaching. But at the same time, a kind of beginning. Something was about to happen. Something that wouldn't undo the past, but would complete history in a way no one expected. And when that happened, the impact wouldn't just be in the words, but in the silence that would follow. The following months unfolded like the final pages of a book that refused to end. Daniel, between the routine of his days and the calm of his nights, began to discover small joys that had been lost during the more difficult periods of his life. The house where he lived now bore no trace of the past. The walls, once adorned with memories of a love that had died silently, were now neutral, almost cold, but intentionally so. He wanted a space where everything could start anew. Mornings were accompanied by fresh coffee, instrumental music, and the company of silence itself, which was no longer as bothersome as before. At times, the absence of noise was almost a comfort. A new ritual was forming, going for a run in the park at 6, reading for an hour before work, calmly cooking his own meals. Each small gesture was an affirmation that moving forward didn't mean forgetting the past, but learning to walk without dragging chains. Sophia had also moved house. Her old apartment now felt like an emotional tomb. She bought a small studio on the other side of town, near a public library where she had begun to spend more time than anywhere else. There, among the ancient bookshelves and the smell of worn pages, I found a kind of peace I hadn't known. I didn't read about love, nor about overcoming. He read about choices, about morality, about the invisible decisions that shape entire destinies. She was obsessed with understanding what drives someone to destroy what they love. Not to justify herself, but to recognize herself. He began to jot down phrases, thoughts, even the silences that emerged in his reflections. His notebooks piled high with scribbled pages, pieces of himself that didn't fit into conversations. Sometimes I wrote letters to Daniel, but never sent them. They began with, "I wish I had been better," and ended with, "I hope you're okay." He wasn't seeking redemption, only understanding. It was on a Saturday afternoon, completely oblivious to any attempt at a reunion, that fate decided, once again, to test the maturity they had both been cultivating. Daniel was attending a lecture on emotional resilience, invited by a friend who had insisted he speak about his experience with forgiveness. Hesitant at first, he eventually accepted. In the small auditorium, surrounded by people with completely different stories, but united by some pain, he shared his journey. He spoke of how he had been betrayed, not only by another presence, but by decisions made in the dark. How he had to rebuild himself from the inside out and, more than that, how he had to let go of his anger to avoid losing himself. He didn't name names, didn't reveal details, but spoke with such honesty that the silence in the room at the end of his talk was almost spiritual. At the back of the auditorium, sitting in the shadows, Sophia listened to every word. She had come by chance, drawn by the topic. She didn't know he would be the speaker. When she recognized him on stage, she considered leaving, but something held her back. And as she listened to everything he said, without rancor, without accusations, with a love already buried but still respected, she understood that this man had, in fact, gone further. And she hadn't yet. After the closing ceremony, people approached Daniel to thank him, comment, and share. Sophia kept her distance. She watched, like someone she once loved becoming whole away from her. As he turned to leave, their eyes met by chance. And in that brief moment, a new kind of silence formed. There was no pain, no desire. Only the recognition of two paths that had separated, but which, in another universe, might have followed together. He walked toward her, unhurriedly, with the serenity of someone no longer carrying any weight. He stopped in front of her and smiled slightly. He said he hadn't known she would be there, and she replied that she hadn't expected to see him either. He invited her for coffee right there in the lobby. She accepted. Sitting face to face once more, the atmosphere was different. Gone was the cafe, heavy with the past, where so many unspoken words had been trapped between them. Now it was a neutral, new place, where the story they once shared seemed to belong to another life. Sophia was the first to speak. She said she was touched by everything he said and that she deeply admired the way he dealt with pain. Daniel replied that there was no other way, that hatred was a dark room where we lock ourselves in and forget how to get out. Sophia agreed. She said she still struggled with her own darkness, but that she was learning to turn on small lights. He smiled and replied that this was a start. The conversation flowed lightly. They touched on everyday matters, laughing over small memories, like someone unearthing old photos from a forgotten box in the attic. At one point, Sophia talked about a writing project she was developing, something almost therapeutic, where she used her experiences to create characters who made mistakes but tried to change. Daniel was interested. He asked if she thought about publishing. She said she didn't have the courage yet. Maybe one day, when she felt worthy of her own story. He replied that, when that day came, he would make a point of reading it. The sincerity in his gaze shattered her insides. There was no judgment, no pity. Only understanding. After that day, they didn't speak again. It was a reunion that didn't ask for continuity, but rather brought closure to what was still pending. Daniel moved on with his life with greater clarity. The woman he had fallen in love with at this new height in his life returned months later, as promised. She brought with her new stories, accumulated memories, and an overwhelming desire to make it work. Together, they decided to start over with more purpose. They bought a smaller house, renovated it themselves, planted a vegetable garden, and created their own rituals. Nothing luxurious, nothing idealized. But everything deeply genuine. Sophia published her first book 2 years later. The title was discreet but loaded with meaning, What Was Unsaid. The story, seemingly fictional, narrated the dilemmas of a woman torn between what she feels, what she fears, and what she destroys. It was an open letter to the past, an attempt to organize the chaos. The book was well received. Not for its technical genius, but for its emotional truth. And, silently, she knew she was finally beginning to forgive herself. Little by little, she built a new relationship with the world. Not as before, not seeking to be loved again at any cost, but seeking to love herself unconditionally. She began giving lectures, writing regularly, counseling women who were lost as she had. And so, discreetly, she transformed guilt into service, pain into raw material, silence into words. The moral dilemma she carried, of having made a choice without the consent of those who also controlled that fate, never left her. But now, instead of paralyzing her, it served as a reminder of what she could never repeat. She didn't seek to erase what she had done, but to ensure that her new version would at least be conscious. And on each page she wrote, she left a part of herself recorded, like an apology to the universe for everything she failed to protect when she had the chance. Daniel, for his part, looked at everything with gratitude. He didn't want to rehash the past or erase memories. But he understood, with the depth of someone who has experienced all layers of pain, that there are loves that teach us, others that hurt us, and others that heal us. And that each, in its own way, is necessary. Their story, after all, wasn't about reconciliation. It was about transformation. And there was still one final piece. A moment when everything they'd experienced would find its definitive place in memory. A moment that was close. And that, without anyone realizing, would end the story as unexpectedly as everything that had built it. 2 years after their last conversation, fate, as if to end it all with one final lesson, crossed paths again, not in cafes, nor in bookstores, nor at carefully planned events. It happened on a random morning, in a hospital. Daniel had taken his father for a checkup, one of those banal adult appointments, without any expectation of emotion. As he sat waiting in the second-floor hallway, he saw Sophia appear around the corner. She was walking briskly, clutching a briefcase to her chest, her hair now tied in a simple bun. She stopped when she saw him, frozen. Not out of embarrassment or discomfort, but out of that kind of astonishment that only occurs when the past decides to remember it still exists. They greeted each other with a brief, knowing, respectful glance. And they continued on their way. Nothing was said there. But that image stuck with Daniel for the entire day. There was no more pain, but there was a silent weight he couldn't explain. Something about unfinished endings, or cycles that refused to close completely. The following week, Daniel received an envelope at his home with no return address. Inside was a copy of Sophia's book with a handwritten dedication. You were the truest part of me. May these pages serve others to choose love before it disappears. Thank you for teaching me what was true, even when I didn't know how to recognize it. Daniel was silent for long minutes. He leafed through the book unhurriedly, recognizing subtle traces of their story in each chapter. There was no exposition, but there was truth. A truth that was now transformed into something greater, something that could touch people who didn't even know them. He closed the book and placed it on his shelf, among those he most respected, not out of affection for its contents, but out of respect for the courage within. The following year, Sophia was nominated for a literary award for her social contribution through writing. The event, held on an elegant and understated evening, brought together authors with careers marked by pain, resilience, and reinvention. Upon receiving the award, she took the stage visibly moved. Her speech, unlike the others, didn't extol victories, but rather confessed mistakes. She said she had built her literary voice on the failures she'd made, that she wrote so as not to forget who she once was, and to try to prevent others from committing the same acts. She concluded by saying that she had learned, through life, that losing a true love can be the kind of pain that teaches you to never live on autopilot again. The audience gave a standing ovation, not for the glamour of the award, but for the honesty of someone who knew how to transform her own failures into bridges. Daniel watched on television, sitting with the woman who now shared his life. She held his hand as he watched in silence. When the speech ended, she looked at him tenderly and asked if he was okay. He smiled and said yes, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. And that was true. No part of him wanted to go back. No desire to rekindle the past. Only gratitude for having survived it all without becoming bitter. She hugged him, and they continued their evening like a couple who know the peace of being where they choose to be, together, with transparency, with truth. A few months later, the publisher that published Sophia's book organized a conference featuring authors who had transformed real experiences into fiction. To the surprise of those involved, Daniel was invited to moderate one of the panels. He had been recommended by Sophia herself, even without his knowledge. She wouldn't be present that day due to commitments abroad, but she wanted him to be there. The event's production team gave him a handwritten letter from her before the panel began. In it, Sophia said she didn't know if she deserved his trust for something so symbolic, but that if anyone could represent the integrity of that story, even if he hadn't written a single line, it was him. And that perhaps, with that gesture, he could finally bring closure, in the right way, to what once had no end. Daniel read the letter right there, sitting backstage. He felt a weight lift in his chest. A kind of true closure. There was no more hurt, no more stinging scars. There was just a story that had finally been told in its entirety. As he took the stage, he spoke about rebuilding, about boundaries, about love and truth. And in the end, he said something that stuck with everyone in the audience: there is no greater pain than being loyal to someone who didn't know how to be true to you. But there is also no greater strength than moving forward without letting that pain define who you will become. And so, without much fanfare, with the simplicity of stories that don't need happy endings, but rather whole endings, it all ended. Sophia went to live abroad, teaching classes on emotional literature and ethics in human relationships. He continued writing, now with more balance, with more empathy. She married years later a journalist she met at a conference, someone who knew her story from the beginning and still chose to stay. She had a daughter, and with her, she learned to love in a way she had never experienced before. There were still times when the past resurfaced in dreams, in involuntary memories, but she didn't fight it. She learned to live with and forgive the woman she once was. Daniel moved on with his life, building a solid family, tending the garden every morning, taking long walks on weekends, and keeping alive the certainty that true love is never a loss, even when the other person didn't know how to receive it. He was happy. And more than that, he was whole. Now that you've made it this far, we want to hear from you. What did you think of this story? Have you ever been through something similar? What would you do in their shoes? Comment below with your opinion, we'd love to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any future stories like this. Here, we tell stories that reveal the deepest sides of the human soul, and always with a clear moral. Because this story, above all, shows us that betrayal doesn't just destroy the relationship. It destroys trust, drains affection, and erodes what's most precious between two people, the sense of belonging. Betrayal doesn't just take the other person away, it takes the most beautiful part of yourself. That's why on this channel, we don't support, romanticize, and will never normalize any kind of betrayal. Until the next story. And remember, true love is built on truth. And truth cannot be hidden.